9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Mark Polymeropoulos, and this is DSR's Above Average Intelligence Show. Today, I am thrilled to welcome as my guest, Nancy Youssef. I have a giant bio here, which I, of course, took from Wikipedia, but I'm going to give some highlights, Nancy, and then we'll talk about how great you are. Nancy is an American journalist currently working as a national security correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. She was previously with the Daily Beast, BuzzFeed News, McClatchy newspapers. She has received numerous awards from the Detroit chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, University of Virginia, the Maryland and D.C. Delaware Press Association. I'm probably getting this all wrong, but I'm sure you have this all up on your wall back home. Everyone's got their "I love me" wall, so I think you probably have one of those too. But you are an institution in the D.C. area. I'm thrilled to have you with us today. You've spent so much time in the region, in the Middle East, a place that I really grew to love, a place, of course, that you are covering amazingly enough yet again. Yeah. Before we go into all of this, I do, and you're going to laugh because I think I mentioned this to you yesterday. My wife has made me watch a show on Netflix that's called Love is Blind, Habibi. I don't think I'm ever getting this time back in my life, but I'm now hooked on it. What do you think? The show's
done its job.
It's Dubai based. It's obviously a dating show, but they're not allowed to see each other. But they kind of talk through a wall, and it's something else. And it's pretty wild.
In all forms.
What's that?
Love comes in all forms.
It does. Anyway, Nancy.
I'll just say this: my family had a lot of prearranged marriages.
Right.
And my mother always said, "Love schmub, that comes later." So, everybody has their way.
I miss this kind of stuff. When I was in, we spent time, I think, when you and I chatted recently, I spent time in Kuwait and Syria, Egypt, in Jordan. But Kuwait was pretty wild in terms of seeing this. Not necessarily, it's not as conservative, of course, as Saudi Arabia, but just how people got married and some arranged marriages and others. But there was this kind of underbelly in Kuwait where I thought I was going to die after this posting, because every night was this party that raged from midnight till 6 a.m, and I had to show up at the embassy at 8 a.m. I thought I went to do war zone tours. That was a war zone.
I mean, certainly for your liver, right? With all the sugary drinks and things, right?
Yeah. Or all the bottles of Johnny Walker Black.
Exactly.
But again, it's a great honor to have you here. One of the things we do on the podcast is I want to certainly go over kind of your journey in journalism, because it's been incredibly impressive and I think really important too. But first and foremost, we always start with current events, and so obviously we had the Israeli strike on Iran. You have written a lot about this. I actually, when you and I did an event at the Hayden Center together, I think your comments on this were outstanding. I wish you actually had more time during that too. I wanted to hear more from you than Ambassador Dennis Ross was amazing.
Well, I felt the same way about you. I was like, ooh, story idea. Ooh, I hadn't thought about that.
So we're going to talk about that in a second. But first of all, your views and comments on the Israeli strike in Iran, just obviously from the kind of day-to-day, but then really where are we in the region right now?
So as you know, we had been waiting for this since October 1st, when Iran launched a barrage of ballistic missiles at Israel, and Israel had promised a response. And the fear had been nuclear or energy sites would have been hit in that response, potentially further expanding the war in the region, hurting oil prices, and having a lot of second and third order effects. And what Israel did instead, from what we can tell, is that they targeted the production of ballistic missiles within Iran, and they targeted air defense around key parts of the country. So it appears to us, we don't have a full battle damage assessment yet, but it appears that they were really trying to weaken the capability of Iran to launch these strikes again. And if they did so, that they would do it with the understanding that they were not in as strong a position to defend themselves from the inevitable response. So it was an interesting approach. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm in Washington about this, that maybe this is going to sort of put into the tit for tat battles, and that this has put Iran back several years. I'm paid to be a skeptic, and so in that vein, I find myself wondering, how quickly could Iran come back from this? Remember, Iran had 3 weeks to prepare for this attack. It's hard for me to believe that they put everything in such a vulnerable state that they didn't have sort of some precautions in place to come back from what they knew was a strike coming upon them. And so how do they bounce back? How quickly do they bounce back? How do they adjust their tactics in response to this? So I think this was a very interesting strike in terms of the impact it has on Iran and its ability to strike at Israel. I think minimally it certainly put a pause in these sort of back and forth barrages of attacks between the two countries. But I think it's dangerous to decide that Iran is out of this, because they play a long game. And what I've seen based on past practices is that they are prepared to they're a country that plans in a longer term fashion in terms of how they would respond to this.
Were you surprised that the Netanyahu government seemed to actually, for perhaps the first time, acquiesce to U.S. conditions? Maybe that's not that. I'm not being fair on that. I mean, I think that actually probably the U.S. has tempered some of the more extreme measures that the Israelis could have taken. So I think the Biden administration doesn't get enough credit for some things related to that. So it's not that Bibi blows us off all the time, most of it, or maybe it's just most of the time. But in this case, it seems that they succeeded. Is there any of that due to the kind of the close cooperation between the U.S. and the Israeli militaries, the relationship maybe that Secretary of Defense Austin has with the Israeli Defense Chief Gallant? I mean, so I guess the question is, why did they seem to listen this time?
So I have two theories. One, in the run up to this, the United States put in a THAAD battery into Israel, which was something they had been asking for months. So if you think of sort of the defense of Israel in sort of concentric circles in terms of, so the U.S. destroyers are in the Eastern Mediterranean, make up that outer circle. That is, they can hit ballistic missiles from the highest point up. The next is the THAAD. The next is David Sling, which is their system. So if you're using David Sling, that's the closest that those missiles will get relative to other defenses. So Israel was really keen to have that THAAD missile defense in there, to add that another sort of circle around the defense of their country. And from what we understand, that one reason the United States finally acquiesced to doing so, and by the way, not only providing the battery, but nearly 100 troops in country to do it, was the promise of some sort of restraint in terms of not going through for some of the most aggressive targets.
Right.
I think the other reason is the danger of sort of hitting everything at once is you lose the ability to escalate. You cut off your escalation ladder, if you will. And so the way the strike plan played out, you could see a scenario where if Iran responds and Israel decides to strike, that they've left room to kind of go up the escalation ladder and so that we're not going right to sort of the most dangerous sort of prospects in terms of war and conflict. So I think those were the two factors that came into play.
So you said that in a much better fashion than I said it this morning on Way Too Early at 5 o'clock in the morning, which I'm sure you were not watching because it's way too early. But I did talk about that escalatory ladder. And in some ways, and tell me what you think about this, and especially because this probably would happen after November 5th, it does open up if Iran perhaps unwisely decides to respond in some kind of, what the Israelis perceive as egregious fashion. These other target sets are open now, energy infrastructure and perhaps even nuclear targets, although there's a question on how much damage they could do. But in some ways, the Israelis, I think, were smart in this because, as opposed to kind of going for kind of the big one, climbing up that ladder. So that begs the next question, what will the Iranians do? You saw, I think, the IRGC chief said something about they have lots of tools in the toolbox. That could be asymmetric warfare. It could be traditional attacks. Again, what's your thought? Do you think the Iranians, in some ways, take the bait and actually do respond in some fashion in which the Israelis will then have an excuse, frankly, to climb up that ladder? And I say this because what I said this morning is this is Israel's Super Bowl. I mean, there is a large part of the Israeli defense establishment who has been itching for this day. And I'm not criticizing them for that. It's just the truth. I mean, you see, there's like sadness in some circles that they didn't go all out now. So what do you think the Iranians are going to do?
He took a lot of criticism from some to the right of him about not doing more. So Iran has publicly said, look, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was not the best you can do. I mean, there's even a little bit of taunting, at least 4 Iranian soldiers were killed, 3 facilities damaged. And so I think what they're signaling to their public is that for time to sort of figure out what their next move is and to not be beholden sort of to the expectation of an immediate response. I think what's interesting in terms of thinking about the responses is their usual responses, a lot of them are gone in the form of their proxies, right?
Right.
In Lebanon with the death of Nasrallah and the key top leadership in Hezbollah, obviously with Hamas, and even in Iraq to some degree, because a lot of those proxies don't want to do anything that could lead to the United States to renege on its promise to leave Iraq by 2026. Now, having said all that, and I keep coming back to this point, I don't think they're out yet. I think there's a rush to sort of say they can't do anything. But even in the case of Hezbollah, we saw them launching attacks on Prime Minister Netanyahu's home within weeks of the death of their leader and this really aggressive campaign into Lebanon. And so I think what they're doing is trying to, at the minimum, set the calendar to a timeline that allows them to respond rather than be drawn into we're going to respond in a way that potentially, as you know, make us fall into some sort of trap where we're doing something that's not in our own interest, but as a need to react to either domestic pressure or some sort of expectation that they need to show that they're not out yet, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. And I want to get your a question, a sense on something kind of bigger picture. I mean, one of the things when we kind of sat down and chatted the other day, I mean, it is pretty wild when you think about the last 20 plus years. And I'd mentioned that I'd gone into Iraq in 03, and you're like, wow, I was there in 03. So I love talking to someone like yourself who, and I will say, has a better view even, or a better understanding of the region than I do, but we both have these shared experiences. And so the question is, I mean, you can't look at what's happening now and ask yourself, should we try to learn from history in terms of, U.S. failures in the region, Israeli failures in Lebanon? But is it also important for us to kind of put some of those biases aside and understand that, the region, everything after October 7th, or a lot has changed. I mean, Hezbollah is gone. That was gone in the sense that was the aircraft carrier that was deterring Israel from striking the nuclear program. All of a sudden, there's a lot of chatter on that. And so I guess the question is, we must learn from history, but we also have to understand that things may have changed. And so I guess what's your thought on that, and how does that translate into better or maybe ever good U.S. policy?
Well, I think it's both, and I think it's why it's so complicated. Because on one hand, there's history has an applicability here, but also the region in real time is changing. Yep. We're watching it change in ways that we don't fully understand yet. I think where history has an application is, we keep seeing these groups form out of the same dynamics that are at play right now, where the U.S. or its allies are trying to get rid of a foe. PLO influence at one point in the 80s, and what emerges instead are these new groups and new offshoots. That's how Hezbollah came to be what it was, and then it just essentially grew from a sort of a below ground sort of organization to an army and a government, and almost so big that it became vulnerable to intelligence, and in Israel's case, an opportunity to come in and really take out the group, and through the intelligence it was able to develop. And so I think the patterns repeat themselves. I think the challenges we are seeing in real time, new dynamics play out, new alliances happening. And so I face the same challenges you do, where when I'm reporting, I don't want to go back to what I know from when I sort of first set foot in the region. But I think very honestly, we have to understand that we are now at a turning point, and it is happening in real time. And so for me, as someone who's watched foreign policy, I think the biggest lesson over the time that you and I have been doing this is that, when I was overseas, I was always struck by how much detail was lost from Iraq or Lebanon or Egypt or Libya or Syria or Afghanistan to Washington. The problem is these places are getting more complicated and a little bit more nuanced. And those little details are the difference between the right policy and the wrong policy. And so if I'm a policymaker, I think I'm a big process person. I think the process has to sort of be reassessed. What are we doing to make sure that those details reach us to help make sure we're making the right decision? It's sort of like, measuring something off by a centimeter. At some point, for enough time, you're completely off. And now we're talking about like a tenth of a centimeter. We're talking about a tenth of a millimeter, like little details that are the difference between right and wrong policy. So when I think about sort of, if I were a policymaker, that's where I think the focus, and also journalistically, that's the focus. How do I make sure that I'm understanding the details and not so focused on what I'm seeing in Washington to understand and report on it accurately? That's where my head is in all this. Understanding that the region is changing in real time.
The hostages and efforts at a hostage deal. We saw CI Chief Bill Burns. It was just with David Barnea, the head of Mossad, who actually is back in Israel now. I just saw a report meeting in the Qatar with the Qataris, perhaps the Egyptians, and there's a new Egyptian proposal for a kind of a limited hostage deal. Do you think there's any chance of any of this? And is the dynamic complicated? Of course, this is a loaded question. Not only by we don't know Hamas's position, but Netanyahu seems to renege on a lot of these deals because of kind of the his reliance on the messianic right. Any chance of anything happening in the next kind of days and weeks?
So I'll give you an optimistic view and a pessimistic one. So the proposal on the table now is 2 days. Right. We went from sort of these multi-phase, multi-week proposals to 2 days, 4 hostages. Right. It's kind of as bare bones as it could be. From, several weeks and then talking about a long-term settlement and what happens. Like, at least there's, I think, an acknowledgement that those sort of big questions, there's no environment to answer them. The pessimist in me says, if we don't know fully what Hamas looks like post-Sinwar, and we don't know how the election is going to change everybody's calculation, and it's only 4 hostages for Netanyahu politically, and with that comes the pressure. I don't mean to say like 4 people are 4 people, but like he would face pressure at that point to release all of them. Is it acceptable for him politically? I don't know if we can get there. It's hard to be optimistic when the problems have been so intractable over the past year. But having said that, this is the first time where I've seen and been able to report and hear from sources that there's some level of potentially, if there's going to be a movement, that we're down to sort of the bare bones in terms of what could be achieved, because both sides arguably have a lot politically at stake. If you're Netanyahu, how many months can you go without bringing anybody home? He's facing that political pressure. Every day those hostages are held, there's the potential that someone dies either from a strike, from starvation, from health issues. And if you're Hamas, you're potentially deeply unpopular. People are starving in the north. That there has to be some pressure there to create something for people to be able to survive the coming weeks. And so I think there's a possibility based on the reporting I have, but having gone through this several times now over the past year, I'm just too frightened to say that this might be the time. But it's different. It's different, and a recognition of what has been unachievable up until this point.
So this is great. So one of the things I do, I love having these conversations because I, of course, blatantly plagiarize what guests say. Your comment there that this is different, I'm going to use that in the future because actually I've been so wrong so many times. The MSNBC correspondent in Israel, Ralph Sanchez. I mean, literally, I think every time he's gone on the air, I've said the hostage deal is coming, and he's like, "Really?" And it never happens. So I told myself I'm out of the predictions stage. But I like that idea of this is different. Let me switch to something that again is what I always believed was important. And when we get to the bonus segment at the end of the show for the subscribers, we're going to talk about the similarities between case officers, what I did for CIA and journalists. But it's the idea of kind of being in the region, of anecdotes, of talking to real people, and does it matter? And so one of the things I've tried to do on MSNBC a lot is talk about, hey, the Israeli public matters on some of these things. And then the Arab street doesn't matter on some of these things. And I've gotten a lot of grief for that, because so many of my friends, particularly in the State Department, really said, look, the Arab world is really inflamed over what's happening in Gaza. And my response is always, but does it really matter? And so I guess the question for you is, think about your last, 25 plus years where you've been doing this. The kind of the famed Arab street, does it really matter now? We're going to get to the Arab Spring later in a second, because that'll be the depressing part of the conversation. But does that matter? Does it have any effect on what you think governments may be willing to do when it comes to, and I'm going to throw one other thing in there, things like normalization? If I was in the region as a CIA officer, I would be taking cabs around, talking to everybody in the street, and I would think that it's end of days. But sometimes it doesn't matter with kind of autocratic regimes whose security services control everything. So throw it out there to you, the Arab street.
The proverbial Arab street. Yep. So I always think of it as mattering in a different way. Does it fundamentally change the outcome for Gaza and the fate of Palestinians? I think it's a factor, but we haven't seen it be a decisive factor, which is what I'm hearing you say in terms of how we're talking about this. My experience in the region, though, is that these things it's the second and third order effects, the pressure on these governments. Some of them, we'll use Egypt as an example. Egypt has been hurting economically for a long time. It has been further sort of hampered by the war directly, because ships aren't going through the Red Sea and are therefore not using the Suez Canal. You have a society that has learned from Arab Spring that the street doesn't necessarily get you the outcome you want. There are people are afraid to say the president's name, let alone, and it's illegal to meet and protest. And so there are fewer and fewer avenues for people to sort of have their grievances heard. And it feels like a Tinder box. I don't have the imagination to tell you where it goes. So to me, the way we think about it, or how I think about it, is how is one area of the world sort of shaping another in maybe ways that I don't understand, and that it's creating pressure points or contributing to existing pressure points on these governments to deliver, to give voice to people who, at least in the case of Egypt, haven't really felt that way for over a decade. And so I think you're right. It's hard to see, and there's no evidence that that the reaction has led to something direct, but it is a factor. The only other thing I'd add is, it's one reason I always have a hard time measuring the street is I think so often people are banned from sort of expressing themselves in a genuine way when you have so many political prisoners and so many limitations on what people can do. Now, maybe that in and of itself limits the effect of the street, but it tells me that I don't fully understand how people feel, because they're not allowed to express it fully because of the very governments that they live under, some of them who feel threatened by even creating a space for their people to be heard on an issue not directly related to them.
So it's a perfect transition to something you and I have discussed in the past, and I asked, I begged, I challenged you to write a story on this, which is the intelligence ties between Israel and some of her Arab allies, or even countries that they don't have formal treaties or formal relationships with. And so, I think I told you the story when I was in Amman, Jordan, many moons ago, walking through GID headquarters, and I hear a helicopter coming in. And who pops off the helicopter? I thought it was the King of Jordan. I thought King Abdullah was going to come visit the GID chief, who at the time was General Rakad. But no, who comes walking around the corner? And it's Bibi. And that always kind of struck me. And even when I spoke to someone who had come back from Amman several months ago, and I said, what is GID telling the Israelis? And the answer was keep going, which is shocking in some sense, because the king and the queen and the foreign minister are railing about Gaza. But it's not shocking if you know the region and in terms of the intelligence ties. And I think my question to you then is, do you think they're as important as I do? And if that's the case, or even if it's not, even if it's to enough of a degree, do you see any fraying of those intelligence ties? This is this is Israel, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Israel, UAE. I mean, these are established, some of them very well established ties. Your thoughts on that?
So I think, let me just say I would do the story, but I don't know if I have the skills to do it because it's such a hard story to get at, right? Your intelligence stories are really hard. Now you're talking about foreign governments. I don't know if I have the skill set for it, but some
yes, you
in
do.
defense of the story. I don't know yet because if you're an intelligence officer, I don't think you're turning down information from anyone, right? That is beneficial for the protection of your own national security interests. And I think the region, despite sort of how binary you make it, I think is sophisticated to understand sort of the dynamics at play, and that it must engage with Israel. And I think we've seen that from these governments. So I think the challenge is how intelligence is being used, how it was used in the run-up to October 2023 when this attack happened, and why those shared intelligence agencies weren't able to sort of do enough or understand enough to sort of foresee and stop the attack. And then how that intelligence has been used over the course of the past year in Gaza, how the war is being prosecuted, how intelligence is being used in Lebanon, which, by the way, is very, in Lebanon, I would argue that Israel has shown far better intelligence nuance than almost anywhere else. It's been extraordinary. And arguably in Iran, too, given the, if the battle assessments that we're seeing initially, anyway, are accurate. So I think in some areas we've seen where there's a real window into the strength of Israeli intelligence and what happens when they work together. But I also think we've seen the dangers of what happens when the intelligence isn't as strong on something as key as trying to eliminate the Hamas threat. And that's why I struggle with the answer, because I think what I've seen in this past year is that in some areas, the intelligence community across the region is extraordinary.
Right.
And in other areas, it's been shockingly weak to me. And how they work together to reconcile that is kind of what I'm watching. And that's what I think about in the next year. How do you reassess that relationship, and how much does the use of that intelligence over the past year sort of shape those relationships?
I still think you need a reporting trip to the region.